Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into something that has probably shaped your life, whether you realize it or not. If you've ever sat in a classroom and tried to learn a second language, there's a huge chance the methods you experienced stem straight from a 100-year-old British framework known as the oral approach and situational language teaching.
Let me ask you a quick question. Have you ever heard of, or maybe even taught using, the PPP format? That's presentation, practice, production. It is an incredibly common way to structure a lesson. Well, as you'll see, this heavily debated yet widely used format is actually the biggest, most enduring legacy of the oral approach.
Here is our agenda. First, origins of SLT. 2, core principles. 3, the structural syllabus. 4, classroom roles. 5, teaching the unit, and we're going to spend the bulk of our time there really getting into the mechanics. And finally, 6, legacy and limitations.
Okay, Section 1, Origins of Situational Teaching, from 1920s British linguists to modern classrooms.
So let's set the scene. Back in the 1920s, British applied linguists like Harold Palmer and A.S. Hornby were looking at the popular teaching style of their day, which was called the direct method, and they just felt it was way too chaotic. It really lacked a systematic basis. They wanted something grounded in science. So throughout the 1930s, they literally conducted these massive frequency counts to figure out the most essential vocabulary and grammar patterns. By the time the 1950s rolled around, this highly structured, meticulously graded methodology had become the standard British approach, and it was officially coined as situational language teaching.
Section 2, Core Principles of SLT, Language as Habit Formation. To really understand this, we need to define what situational language teaching actually is. It's a systematic oral approach where new language points are introduced and practiced in concrete situations, completely without translation. In an SLT classroom, the target language is the absolute exclusive language you hear. There's no stopping to explain grammar rules in the student's native tongue. Instead, language is viewed purely as a purposeful activity. You teach meaning by creating a clear visual situation right there in the physical world.
This perfectly captures the era's absolute obsession with behaviorism. Listen to this quote from French back in 1950. He argued that the fundamental goal is correct speech habits cultivated by what he called blind imitative drill. You see, learning a language wasn't viewed as some creative, cognitive process back then. It was literally seen as forming physical habits. You listen, you repeat, you do it until it's entirely automatic. And mistakes, well, those were to be avoided at all costs, because making a mistake might form a bad habit.
Section 3, the Structural Syllabus, Building Blocks of Language.
To make sure these habits formed perfectly, linguists realized they couldn't just throw random conversational phrases at students. They needed a highly controlled sequence. If you take a typical 1957 syllabus by Frisbee, for instance, you won't find a list of fun thematic topics like at the airport or ordering food. No, it's a strict structural syllabus. The entire English language is broken down into underlying sentence patterns. And what's really fascinating is that vocabulary, words like book, pencil, chair, is chosen purely based on how well it helps the teacher demonstrate the underlying grammar pattern, like this is or these are. The golden rule was that simple forms must always precede complex ones.
Section 4, Classroom Roles, the Conductor and the Chorus. When you have a syllabus that rigid, the dynamics in the classroom have to be completely controlled. The teacher in this model is essentially a highly skillful orchestra conductor. They are the manipulator, actively drawing the performance out of the students, using questions, rapid commands, and visual cues. They entirely dictate the timing, the pace, and the corrections. On the flip side, the learner, especially early on, simply listens and repeats. They have absolutely zero control over the content of what they're learning. They are just the chorus, meant to respond instantly and form habits without ever really initiating a thought on their own.
Okay, Section 5, Teaching the Unit, the Masterclass in Action. This is the real core of our explainer today. Let's actually step inside the classroom. We've got the theory, but how do you physically put this into practice? How do you get this orchestra to play?
This is where we hit the famous PPP model, that enduring legacy we talked about at the very beginning. Teaching a unit in this framework happens in 3 strictly ordered phases. First up is presentation, where the teacher uses visuals or physical objects to introduce a grammar structure and a highly controlled situation. Second is practice, where learners relentlessly drill that structure using repetition and substitution. And finally, production, where learners attempt to transfer that structure into slightly freer, more natural communication.
Let's really zoom in on that presentation phase because it's fascinating. Take an actual lesson script from Pittman, for example. It is so vividly physical. The teacher doesn't just stand there and explain the concept of a watch. They hold up a physical watch and firmly state, "Look, this is a watch." Then they point across the room to the wall and say, "That's a clock." They tap the blackboard. They do this over and over, modeling the target language while constantly interacting with concrete objects. The meaning is induced entirely visually. Not a single translated word is ever uttered. Then, on cue, the chorus joins in. The teacher prompts and the students instantly echo. This is a pen, that is a pencil.
Once the presentation is locked in, we enter the practice phase. And wow, this is where the heavy lifting happens. Davies and his colleagues mapped out this incredibly vigorous, rhythmic sequence of drilling activities. It kicks off with listening practice. Then, the entire class repeats together in choral imitation. Then, the teacher singles out specific students for individual imitation. If someone messes up a sound, you isolate it. Then you use hand gestures to elicit the pattern without speaking. It is literally a meticulously choreographed dance of substitution, question and answer, and immediate, swift correction if anyone steps out of line.
To keep this intense drilling moving at a fast clip, the teacher completely relies on their kit. Imagine a box filled with realia, just everyday common objects. If the goal for the day is to teach the structure, there's a noun of noun in the box, you don't just write a formula on the board. No, you reach into your box and pull out a tin of cigarettes. There's a tin of cigarettes in the box. Next, you pull out a reel of cotton. There's a reel of cotton in the box. The teacher swaps the objects rapidly, and the students simply substitute the new vocabulary into the rigid grammatical frame. This physical swap creates the situation needed for nonstop, rapid-fire substitution drilling.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, Legacy and Limitations. Does PPP still hold up today? It is undeniably an incredibly focused way to teach the mechanics of a language. But to see the whole picture, we have to look at the massive backlash this method faced in the mid-1960s.
Despite its worldwide popularity, applied linguists eventually hit a wall. They started noticing a glaring flaw: the transfer problem. You see, you can run students through choral imitations and substitution drills all day long. They might master the grammar structure perfectly inside the 4 walls of the classroom while you're holding up a reel of cotton, but the second they step outside into the real world and try to have an authentic, unpredictable conversation, they completely freeze. Critics loudly argued that this highly controlled practice simply does not adequately prepare a human being for the chaotic, messy reality of actual free communication.
Yet, despite all of those intense criticisms, core elements of this approach have survived. PPP is still taught in teacher methodology courses globally. Grammar is still more often than not graded from simple to complex in textbooks everywhere. So I want to leave you with a provocative thought straight from our source material today. Think about your own language learning journey, or if you teach, think about your own classroom mechanics. Does the PPP lesson cycle play any role in what you do today? Have we really moved on from the 1950s, or in some ways, are we still just playing the roles of the conductor and the chorus? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I hope it gives you a fresh, totally new lens through which to view language learning.